Welcome back to another episode of the State of Sustainability. This is another content bite, and in this one I'm going to talk about why it's the end of ESG as we know it, and I feel fine. So in this episode, we're going to talk about one of my favorite bugbears, which is ESG. I really hate ESG. I have to say I hate the term, and I always kind of have. And the reason is, and I'm going to sort of maybe give a little bit of context for why I dislike the term, but then I also want to go a little into the history of it and what I think the future holds for it. The reason I dislike ESG is it sort of clubs together things that are completely unrelated and uncomparable. And as a sort of recovering analyst, I always try and find comparability and trade-offs between different sets of metrics, especially if you're trying to optimize for them as a group, which most businesses are when they're thinking about ESG reporting and disclosure. And so if you look at the components that come within ESG, there is usually no single source of truth on what you should be reporting on within ESG. I've seen all flavors, all stripes, all standards. The maximum I've ever seen is about 218 different KPIs under an ESG umbrella for an individual business. And so if you kind of take that as the high watermark, certainly the highest that I've seen, the minimum we're probably talking is 20 or 30 different metrics. And those metrics might be as different as the, let's say, presence of slavery within the value chain, for instance, or the presence of child labor within the value chain, and instances of lawsuits addressed to the business and emissions or water intensity of the business. If you look at these three different random KPIs that I've chosen from an ESG basket, there is literally nothing that unites them. Businesses that do really well against one might do really badly against the other, and there's really no ability to compare and contrast them. So what we're doing with ESG is we're taking a basket of things that have no relationship to each other, and we're sort of clubbing them under one roof. There is no other business function where this is the case. If you take, let's say, the digital function or the IT function, you take the finance function, you take procurement, you take sales, you take marketing, there is always a point of synergy between pretty much all of the KPIs that are important to that business. And if I think of sales and marketing, for example, within sales and marketing, you're typically thinking about how many opportunities do I have? What is the size of those opportunities? What is the lead time? What is the conversion rate? Different teams within that might be optimizing for different things, but they all meet at some point. Whereas in ESG, these are all different. So that sort of begs the question, why do we even talk about ESG? Where did ESG come from? Who dreamed this thing up? That makes no real sense. Now, the funny thing is that it's actually not very easy to find this out. So I had to do a little research. I kind of tried to find what are the earliest origins. And if you go and, you look at the Wikipedia article, for example, you find that the first mention of this was a 2004 report. Which I think is a UN report. But actually, you kind of try and go deeper because that report references it as though it's a known thing. That's the first sort of real public, semi-formal, semi-legal mention of this term. But for it to have been mentioned there, it would already have been used in a general setting. So you kind of go a little deeper. And then what I found actually is that it was first contrived as a way to get a small set of financial institutions to think about the other stuff beyond the financial stuff. And so the whole logic was, look, there's all the stuff that you financial institutions do for your main business. And then there is this other stuff that you should also be looking at when you're investing in a business, when you're lending to a business. There is this sort of, these qualitative aspects. And maybe it's about risk. Maybe it's about, are they good corporate citizens? All these things. And this should also be a thing. That was where ESG came from. And when you look at it through that lens, when you say actually ESG was originally contrived as a way for organizations that are outside of the operations of a business, that is financial institutions that are lending to or investing in other businesses, they are inherently outside those businesses looking in, ESG becomes a lens through which those institutions see that business. I see you as a basket of risks and opportunities. I see you as your citizenship qualities, or do you have a great brand because you're doing good for the earth, etc. And yes, maybe then I do want to look at actually, do you have a bunch of lawsuits to your name, or like a bunch of villages actually kind of militating against you because you've polluted their waters? What is your emissions footprint? Are you a high emitter or a low emitter? All these things you could see becoming part of a checklist, for instance, that such institutions might have when they look at at these businesses. And the expectation would probably not have been at that point that this checklist would really materially sway a decision on whether to invest or whether to lend. But this checklist should at least maybe just inform, let's say the quality with which the asset is viewed. Basically, and maybe the brand positioning and maybe the way that the opportunity to invest or lend is marketed to other participants. What I think you'll notice a few things, right, in what I'm describing here. One is that this first mention of ESG did not really relate to operating companies at all, actually. The second is that this ESG framing was inherently outside in. The third is that this ESG framing was inherently on the side, in other category and other stuff. And the final one is that this ESG bucket was really something that might be seen as a checklist rather than the comprehensive data sets and strategies and roadmaps and transition plans and teams and functions that we sort of expect today. And so every now and then, and I kind of learned this at McKinsey, every now and then businesses do funny things. And they either do funny things individually or they do funny things in groups. When I sort of grew up looking at, adults and businesses as a child, I sort of imagined adults are infallible and businesses also all function in sophisticated ways that the rest of us mere mortals can't fathom. And then over years and years of consulting, I realized actually businesses often do really random things that make no sense. And industries, frankly, as collections of businesses also really do sometimes random things that make no sense. And I see ESG as one of those things. It sort of came up in one place, it then grew, and it then took on a life of its own in a completely different context. And frankly, Scope 3 is very similar, actually. Scope 3 originated as a way for us to think about national emissions budgets and then industry emissions allowances. And then from there, somehow it became a reporting standard for individual businesses to think about. And, when you kind of look at it that way, you're like, wow, okay, I can see why Scope 3 seems completely illogical to me in a business operating sense. And ESG is kind of the same. That's a little bit of the history side. Now let's look at the future. ESG now has a really bad rep. I think it's really interesting when you look at this in the UK and when you look at this in the US. In the US, I think, and I think this is different in different parts of the United States, ESG has become almost like this starting gun for a political debate wherever you go. And I think that's because ESG as a topic has been so heavily politicized and is identified now as there's this whole topic about how politicians and governments in the US have sort of left behind large segments of the population. And I think ESG has started to represent the concern that decision makers have for other things beyond the average person. Basically, the concern that they have for abstraction, the concern that they have for smaller minorities versus the majority, the concern that they have for all these other topics beyond what is important to many average people, which is, am I going to be able to bring food home? Do I have a job? Do my kids go to school? Is there basic healthcare for me? And I'm obviously not saying that ESG merits all of this, but I think ESG has just become to represent a lot of this stuff that people dislike because they don't feel it's actually about them. And I think that the most politicized elements of ESG are actually very likely the social column specifically. I very rarely find anyone who is super critical about the governance column, for example. Like most individuals, if you say, look, should an organization have good governance, which means should it have an ombudsman, should it have like a process for surfacing complaints, should it have like a whistleblower policy if there's something going wrong within the business? I think these are very hard things to argue with. And so governance actually tends to be, almost uncontroversial, funnily enough. The environment tends to be much more politicized than governance. And within the environment, I actually find there's also a spectrum of things that are highly politicized versus not very politicized. I actually find that almost universally, despite the fact that water is treated as not super important from a corporate perspective, water from an average person perspective tends to be one of the least controversial things for people to optimize for. And I think that the history of caring about water goes back really decades and is literally universal. I remember at college studying the impact that Shell had on the Niger Delta, and it was about water pollution and about water rights, and it was not actually about emissions or oil in general. It was just about, literally you're polluting the drinking supply. There's any number of movies that have been made about polluting water supplies. You go to China and you find environmental issues that are hot topics, and it's going to be water. You go to Pakistan, where I'm from, and you find the hot button environmental topics, and it's going to be water. It's going to be flooding. It's going to be clean water supply. It's going to be these things. So despite the fact that water tends not to be the most important metric from a business perspective for ESG, I find water to be one of the least controversial environmental metrics. Climate change obviously has been inherently politicized over a couple of decades now. But what I'm really getting at, this is not going to be a blow-by-blow of each of the 218 metrics I come across within ESG, but what I'm really getting at is each of these metrics has a different personality. Actually, each of these little buckets and sub-buckets has a very different personality. And I don't think it is possible for us to save brand ESG. I think brand ESG had a brief life. It probably should never have existed, if we're honest. And it is now being put to bed forcefully. And I'm sorry if this acronym meant something to you, but I think that it is being put to bed. And I think that that is a good thing, because I think it allows us to really stop looking at ESG as a checklist, stop looking at ESG as though it's something that other people are identifying when they look at me and my business, and actually say, great, let's take a thing, a topic, a mission, a goal, an objective, a KPI, and let's figure out how we make this work in our business. As a business, we really want to care about water, or we really want to care about emissions, or we really want to care about building a diverse workplace, right? Whatever it is, let's first say, why is this important to us? Is it important to us because it's a requirement from regulations perspective, and that's actually all the reason that we care? In which case, fine, let's just do the bare minimum, let's just comply, let's play the game, and let's go on with life. Or is this important for us because for some reason this is table stakes for our business? This is a core priority for our business. And there are many ESG metrics where when you pull them out of this random mix of Red Riding Hood's basket, the metric is actually really important for you. If you look at water and you're a beer company and you don't have access to water, good luck making your beer. If you're a mining business and you are not prioritizing the welfare of the community around the place where your mine is, you are going to struggle to hire people. You are going to struggle to operate smoothly and effectively without disruption, and you may well lose your license to operate. There are many individual ESG metrics that are critically important to many different businesses, and there is no one size fits all really. And I think when we start splitting this basket apart and looking at it that way, there's a bunch of things that we can do differently. One is that we can say, great, we're going to optimize for this thing. It's not 50 things, it's 5 things. And within those 5 things, there's a clear prioritization. And I think that's important for C-suite and CEOs as well, where every business that I speak with, the CEO is saying to the sustainability team, hey, you get 3 things that you can focus on. And really that means you get 1 thing and 2 sides. The other thing is that we can operationally set up to deliver this, which means that you don't say, well, good luck ESG team. We want you to now optimize 218 things, which mean that you need to somehow have a span of control across the full business and the full supply chain and the full distribution. And yeah, we don't have any money for you yet, but we want you to make it happen and we're really behind you. And I think you can move away from this to actually saying, okay, we want to build a diverse workforce, and we want to do that because we think that gives us the best access to talent. And therefore, we're going to give this mandate and this mission, let's say, to our talent team, because we're seeing this as a talent topic, and therefore talent should own this, and we're going to own the diversity topic at the start of the talent funnel when we acquire talent. We are going to try and market ourselves to talent across a broad spectrum. We're going to try and optimize our recruitment process for that sort of talent, and we're then going to try and bring them in and then manage that talent journey all the way through to talent progression, because this topic, this hitherto ESG topic, is a critical strategic priority, and it belongs with our talent team. And I think that's a way that you really get that moving. Similarly, if you look at, let's say, water, maybe you see water as a core operational topic. You're a beer business. Like, water is actually an operating, resource for you. Or you're a manufacturing business and water is key for cooling down your equipment and some of the inputs. And so water is a core operational manufacturing topic for you, and you're going to give that to your manufacturing or your ops team. I think that when you start disambiguating these metrics, you can really say, what are the things we care about? Which which team are we going to give them to, and how do we quantify what the value of doing this well versus really, really well is for our business. So I think this is going to be a super helpful shift. Frankly, I can't wait for ESG to sort of be put to bed. But that doesn't mean that I'm excited about losing sight of the underlying pieces. Frankly, 218 metrics is way too much. I think it's much better if sustainability teams do fewer things, but do them with depth, do them with consistency, do them with longevity, and ultimately do them with impact. You will probably hear more of this in subsequent episodes because, like I said, it's one of my favorite bugbears, but I just thought I'd try and bring that all together into one place so that when they're looking for stuff to write on my tombstone, no one is short of content. So I clearly think ESG is either dead or dying. I clearly think that this is not a good thing as long as we don't lose sight of the underlying stuff or the stuff in the basket. But I'd love to hear your views. So look me up on LinkedIn, drop me a note. If you have some stuff that you think I should have said differently or looked at it from another angle, I'd love to hear that. And I'd love to actually maybe bring it into another episode as well. Thanks very much for listening to this edition of the State of Sustainability podcast. Please hit follow or subscribe so you get notified as soon as our next episode drops.